Hello everyone, it's Channin here for Pinkfresh Studio. In today's video, I'm going to share with you my favorite way to add color to vellum. We're going to use ink and our layering stencils. This is a great technique for stretching those stamp, stencils, and foil sets. Today I'm going to focus on the delicate Rosebud stamp set. There's also a foil plate as well, and everything I'm doing today could be applied to a foiled image as well. I'm going to first stamp this onto an A2 panel of vellum. I am going to heat emboss, so I did apply some anti-static powder. Now I'm inking up my stamp in an embossing and watermark ink, stamping that image a couple of times to make sure I've got plenty of that embossing ink down, and then I'm going to dip it into some gold embossing powder. Once I've tapped off the excess, then I'll of course heat set with my heat tool, and then we'll have this beautiful rosebud image ready for us to ink blend. I have the delicate rosebud stencil set here. There are 4 stencils in this set, and I will be using them in order. Each one of these stencils is labeled. In the upper left corner, you can see here it's labeled Stencil 1. We're going to do something different though. We're going to flip our image over. So I flipped my vellum over. So I'm looking at the back side of my stamped image. And then I also flipped over my stencil. So we're actually looking at the back side of our stencil as well. We have to flip that stencil over so it lines up with the backside of the stamped image, and by doing this on the backside of our stamped image, we are making sure we don't have to bother with cleaning our heat embossed image later. And if you did this with hot foil, you wouldn't have to clean your hot foil later. So this is a really helpful tip and something fun that you can do with vellum. Now I am starting with white pigment ink as a base. The pigment ink is going to add to the opacity of the dye ink that we add later, and so the colors just show up more vibrant and vivid. I did quickly clean off my stencil to remove any of that excess white pigment ink, and now I'm ink blending with Meadow Pinkfresh Dye Ink over all of those openings with the white pigment ink. And once we finish with that, we'll move on to a darker shade. Now you may notice that Meadow was a little contaminated with the white pigment ink. That's not going to really affect my ink pad at all, but you again can reduce that by cleaning your stencil and removing that excess pigment ink. Now with this darker ink, which is Tidal Pond, I'm just ink blending at the base of each one of these leaves just to kind of create a little gradation over the leaf, which is really fun that you can still kind of create gradations even with that base of the white pigment ink. We're now on to stencil number 2. Again, I'm going to flip over my vellum and then flip over my stencil, line up my stencil with the stamped image, and then I'm going to grab my pigment ink and do another layer of this white pigment ink. I'm actually using scrapbook.com, but really any white pigment ink will do. Here you can see me cleaning my stencils to kind of remove that excess ink. And now we'll move on to our dye ink. For the rosebuds, I'm starting with passion fruit, and we'll just quickly ink blend that. And just like with the leaves, we'll move on to a darker shade to kind of create a little gradation. I'm using Berrylicious here, and I'm just going to ink blend at the base of each of these rosebuds with my smaller blending brush with that darker red, just to kind of create a beautiful ombre look over the rosebud. Once we finish with that, we'll be on to stencil number 3. Already looking really beautiful, and you could stop here, but the next 2 stencils are detail layers. So here is stencil 3, which is a detail layer for all the leaves. Again, I'm going to flip over my vellum, flip over my stencil, line that up. I do want to warn you here that because we're using pigment ink and vellum, the ink takes longer to dry, so you just want to be careful here and be mindful that that ink is still wet when you're laying on the next stencil, and try not to shift your stencil too much. However, you might get a little smearing if you do. Now for this layer, we're just going to quickly ink blend in Tidal Pond, just really simple, this really dark teal color that we used earlier, and that's going to add a nice detail to those leaves. I love the way that just kind of enhances everything a little bit more. And then we're on to our last stencil here. This is stencil number 4, the detail for the rosebuds. Again, flip my vellum over, flip my stencil over, line up my stencil openings with the image. And for this one, I'm going to just simply ink blend with that Berrylicious, that dark red again, over all the openings to kind of create a little bit of contrast for that details for the rosebuds. And after we finish ink blending that, we are done with our colored vellum image. I actually am going to repeat these steps again and create a second rosebud or acetate rosebud image. And now I'm going to grab the Delicate Rosebud die set and die cut these images out. So they're a little bit easier to work with and for me to place both of them onto an A2 card base. So here are my die cut images out, and we're now ready to kind of create our background. So I have a panel here of pink cardstock. It's a little bit smaller than an A2 panel. It's 4 1/8 by 5 1/2, and I'm going to ink blend on the left side with passion fruit ink. Just going to do a soft gradation along that left side, kind of going out a little bit further at the bottom. I am using Pinkfresh Studio's 1/2-inch blending brush. I am tapping off the excess onto one of the stencils from the Delicate Rosebud set, just using that kind of like a scrap piece of paper. Once I like or finish with this soft blend, I then am going to move on to some splatters. I have Berrylicious ink pad here, just pressed it onto that stencil, spritzed it with some water. We're going to mix that water and ink together just to kind of water it down and make it a little bit more fluid. Then I will pick up some of that watered down ink with my paintbrush here and just tap on my paintbrush to release a splatter along that left side where I ink blended. And this will just really create a beautiful background that's subtle but adds still a lot of interest. And there's our finished background. We're now going to move on to our sentiment. I have the Delicate Rosebud stamp set here again. I've grabbed a sentiment off from that set, and I'm going to stamp it onto a scrap of white cardstock. I applied some anti-static powder, inked it up in my embossing and watermark ink, dipped it into my gold embossing powder, and then I'll heat set here with my heat tool. The awesome thing about this set is there are also matching dies for some of the sentiments. One of the sentiments being this one here, so I grabbed the die, lined it up with the sentiment, and ran it through my die cutting machine, and now I have this perfectly die cut sentiment. And we're ready to kind of bring this card together. I'm going to start by arranging my florals here. I'm going to arrange them on that left side, but I am first going to trim off one little section here of leaves just because I felt like they overlapped too much there and it looked a little bit busy. I will actually save that little snippet of leaves and put it in the up at the top, kind of fill in a little bit of an open area there. Once I get my arrangement kind of the way I like it, we will then grab a piece of tape. So I'm still working here, arranging, because I kind of I moved them a little bit. And I'm going to use a low tack tape here. Just any tape will do. Washi tape is fine. Just to kind of hold these die cuts in place. And then we'll flip that pink panel over. And then we're going to use some liquid glue and adhere the ends of our florals down to the back side. Because we're using vellum here today, we want to be very mindful of our adhesives that we use to kind of stick this down and be kind of clever, because adhesive will show even behind the more opaque areas where we ink blended. So you have to be very careful here, and by kind of tucking those ends and adhering them to the back side of that panel, we'll kind of hold them in place without the adhesive showing. I then adhered the panel to an A2 top folding white card base, and now we're going to carefully remove the tape. We will add a little bit more adhesive to the back side of some little areas here and there, especially this loose little leaves that we snipped off earlier. I'm just going to add a little bit of adhesive under the little bit of the heat embossing area, and then tuck that under one of the leaves, and then I'll lift up some of the gold embossed areas and just add a little dab of glue just to kind of hold them in place a little bit. Most of the florals are really being held in place by the ends that we glued earlier, and then second by this sentiment. This sentiment has foam adhesive on the back side. Just remove the backing, and now I'm going to place it over some of the leaves and stems, and that's going to really kind of hold them in place. I don't want to glue all these florals down permanently, because when you see I hold this up to the camera, they lift up beautifully and they just have this soft, fluttery look, and I just love that. So that's another kind of bonus with this vellum. And that's the finished card. I hope you guys found this video helpful on how to add some color to the back side of your vellum images. And this is, I think, is again a really great way to stretch those stamp, stencil, and foil sets. As always, thank you so much for watching, and if you have any questions about the products I used, please check out the links below in the description. Thank you so much, and I'll see you again next time.